Everybody. Today we are going to talk about communities. So, what we need to discuss is that, remember, a population is a group of all the same species at the same time. And a community is going to be several populations interacting with one another in an ecosystem. So, a community is made up of many different populations. We're going to study how communities interact with one another by talking about competition, predation, that's when one thing eats another, and symbiotic relationships, which is other types of relationships besides predation and competition where two things are going to interact in ways that we may not have thought of before. In order to understand communities, we need to understand what a niche is. An ecological niche is an organism's role, or like its job, in the ecosystem. And it encompasses all the aspects of a species' way of life, including where that species lives, the habitat, how it acquires energy. Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Is it a decomposer? Where does it get its energy and materials from? And what else does it interact with? What are the other relationships that it has? All of those things are part of a niche. So, what is the niche of the following three organisms? An owl, an oak tree, and a bacteria. Take a moment to discuss what those niches could be. So for an owl, you may have said something like it eats rodents, it makes its home in a tree, it's active at night. All of those things could be part of its niche. An oak tree, you could have said something like it provides shade. It's going to compete with the grass. If you see down below here, right, the grass is getting shaded, so it's not going to be able to grow as much. It provides food and shelter for other animals. It might have moss or lichens growing on its bark. That's also part of its niche. And a bacteria can do lots of things. They can break stuff down. They can cause illness. They can be helpful. So bacteria also have a number of things. One community interaction is competition. So competition is when two things are vying for the same limited resource, right? So two things that are trying to get a specific type of food, that is competition. Each species is harmed as access to resource is reduced. So when you have competition, it is like a lose-lose scenario, because even if the competition is weak, that still means there's fewer resources for everybody when two species compete. So competition is a lose-lose scenario. That's why I wrote the negative up there. We can have competition between species. So here, a hyena and a lion are going to compete for resources. They're two different species. Typically, the lion is going to be the better competitor, but not always. And hyenas still apply a certain pressure. They make it a little bit harder for lions to get food. Or they can be introspecific, like these squirrels, which are fighting over some food. They are of the same species, so they're fighting with other members of their own population. If two species occupy the exact same niche, so if they do the exact same thing, one is going to outcompete the other. So one will eliminate the other. That is unlikely to happen, because what's probably going to happen before that is one, the worst competitor will have to adjust. It will have to change niches. So for example, if the lion and the hyena are both going for a particular type of food and the hyenas are being outcompeted, then instead of risking elimination, the hyenas are simply going to eat something else that the lions aren't going to eat. Here we have an experiment that was done where we have two paramecium, Aurelia and Caudatum. So two different types. Aurelia is in blue, Caudatum is in red. They compete. When they're grown in separate flasks, their growth looks like this top graph here. When they are grown in the same flask, notice how it's different. What do you think this shows? Take a moment and write down what you think this is going to show. So you can see that separately, they have the same growth pattern, right? They both go up in this exponential growth curve, and then the carrying capacity sets in and they sort of level off at the same rate, right? But what's happening down here is the Aurelia grows but the caudatum goes down in population, and that is because the Aurelia seems to be the better competitor here. When they are together in the same flask, the Aurelia wins that competition, and the caudatum, look down here, it's either at risk of being eliminated or it needs to change its niche. One other thing I want to point out is that notice how the Aurelia grown in a separate flask can have a population density of 200. Does it get that high when they're in the same flask with the caudatum? We can see no, it doesn't get that high, right? So it is in fact harmed. It's not able to grow to its full potential, and that is due to competition, which even though the Aurelia is winning the competition, it's still kind of a lose-lose scenario. So one way to help prevent niche overlap is resource partitioning. This is when species that compete a lot are going to focus on two different parts of the resource spectrum. So what might this look like? This is going to reduce competition, and an example is the North American warblers. This is a bird, and this is what they're going to do. They all kind of have the same habitat and the same niche. So to help relieve themselves of that competition, they have found different parts of the trees to live in. Some live closer to the bottom, some live up high, some live inside, some live towards the outside. This reduces competition, allowing all of these types to thrive, because competition harms both members of the competition. Predation involves one animal killing another animal in order to eat it. Predators have evolved characteristics that increase their chances of catching prey, and the prey have also evolved characteristics that decrease their chances of being eaten. Two of those characteristics are camouflage and mimicry. Here we have camouflage. This is a fish that's going to blend in with the sand and the rocks that are found at the bottom of these streams. So it fits in really well, and it's hard to see. So if you're trying to eat that fish, you're probably going to miss it. Here's a nightjar bird of Central America. Again, hides very well from predators. We have insects that look like leaves or sticks, again, hiding from birds. We have a moth here that is camouflaged as bird poop, right? So birds are going to avoid that. Sea dragon looks like seaweed. This cactus looks like blends in pretty well with a rock, considering it's a cactus. So all these things help an organism hide. Even plants have these adaptations. Cheetahs have camouflage, helps them hunt. You're less likely to see the cheetah in the grass because it blends in pretty well. Here, this looks like a sponge or some bits of coral. It actually has this little thing here that's another trick, kind of helps it to lure a fish over, and then it can reach out and hunt when the fish is drawn to that thing but doesn't see the frogfish. And then there's mimicry. Mimicry is a situation in which one species has evolved to resemble another. So an example of this would be bees, hornets, and yellow jackets. They have the same black and white stripes, and those black and white stripes are a warning, and everybody knows it, right? Stay away from things with black and white stripes. So all three of those different harmful species have shared that pattern because it's convenient. Monarch and viceroy butterflies also share an orange and black pattern. Viceroy butterflies are fine, but monarchs taste really bad to birds. So the viceroy is kind of benefiting from the fact that it looks like a monarch, even though there's really nothing distasteful about it. A harmful hoverfly is going to look like a bee, but it's a fly. And a harmless king snake is going to resemble a coral snake. And we're going to find out what's going on there. So here we see these color patterns. Black and a bright color are kind of a warning in nature to stay away. I'm poisonous, I'm distasteful, I'm going to harm you if you eat me. There's a poisonous frog. Again, that color pattern, even though it makes it stick out, it's a warning. Here we have the distasteful butterfly. Here we have snakes that look like a cobra. So this is a harmful cobra, and these two snakes are not really that harmful, but they look like a cobra, so you're going to stay away from it. And here are bees, wasps, hornets share a similar color pattern, and some flies kind of ride those coattails and look like a harmful insect as well. the coral snake and the king snake. The non-venomous snake looks like the venomous one. Okay, and then we have symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic relationships are another type of interaction between different species. The first type is parasitism. This is pretty easy. It's when a parasite is going to infect a host. This is a win-lose relationship. The parasite is going to benefit, but the host is clearly going to be harmed. So the parasite lives in the host and benefits by feeding on it, but parasites usually don't kill the host because that would then harm the parasite. The parasite wants the host to keep living, so it's not going to eat the host. Tapeworm in humans, fleas, some disease-causing protozoa, bacteria, and viruses can all act as parasites. Then we have commensalism. One species benefits and the other species is totally unaffected, like barnacles, which stick to things like rocks and ships. They sometimes hitch a ride on the skin of huge whales. And this doesn't really affect the whales. Most whales are so big, they're not affected by a barnacle at all. It doesn't harm them. It doesn't help them. It's nothing. So commensalism benefits one thing, and the other thing is basically unaffected. Then we have mutualism. This is a win-win scenario. This is when two things benefit. An example is lichens. Lichens are an entity formed by fungus and an algae. So the algae undergoes photosynthesis and produces sugar, which it shares with the fungus. The fungus helps extract nutrients from dead and decaying matter, and it can share those nutrients with the algae. So they're sharing with one another, and they both benefit. That is mutualism, win-win scenario. The Finding Nemo example, a clownfish and a sea anemone. The fish get protection because a sea anemone is poisonous for many things, so they won't go into it. And the fish then is going to clean for the anemone. So the fish gets a home and protection. The anemone gets cleaned. There's lichen. So algae and fungus make up this structure here called the lichen. And this is clownfish. Now, many communities have what is referred to as a keystone species. A keystone species is really important because if you get rid of a keystone species, it is going to dramatically alter the community. So a good example of this is the predatory starfish pisaster, which you're going to find in the Pacific Northwest along the coast. Often we don't think about this, but starfish are major predators. If you pick one up and turn it over, on the underside, you're going to find a mouth. So that mouth has a stomach. They actually extend their stomach through their mouth, and it develops smaller organisms, and it brings them in. The starfish is a major predator. It eats a lot, and it really keeps its entire ecosystem, its entire community in check. Here we see the starfish clinging to the wall, and they're going to be moving on the wall and the floor, and they're going to be eating lots of different things, lots of mussels and other little invertebrates. So here's what's happening. Here's the starfish. It's eating chitons, it's eating limpets, it's eating snails, it's eating barnacles, it's eating a lot. And it's keeping all of these populations down. So what happens if we get rid of the starfish? Well, let's go back to this one. If we get rid of the starfish, then what's eating these things? The answer is nothing. Nothing is eating these different things. So their populations explode way, 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 way up. And they can overwhelm the community. And they can take over and they can do some real damage. So here is an example of studying an ecosystem by removing starfish from the ecosystem. So our y-axis is the number of species present. And then this is time on the x-axis. When there's starfish over time, what's happening to the number of species? As you can see there, the number of species is going up. When you remove the starfish, what happens? The number of species plummets, right? Why is that? Because nothing is eating the barnacles and the snails, all the things here. Nothing is eating these. Their populations explode, and then these animals eat themselves out of house and home, and there's nothing left. And so the entire community implodes. So even though starfish are predators, they play a very important role in the environment. We need these starfish. They are the most important species in their community. Another keystone species is the otter. So otters eat urchins. And urchins, you may not realize this, but urchins are voracious eaters of plant life in the oceans. So basically, otters keep the urchin population in check, and that means that the urchins don't devour all of the kelp, and there's plenty of kelp, which means there's plenty of other animals in this environment. But what happens when some orca whales migrate over? And the orca whales eat all of the otters. There's no more otters, or very few. The number of urchins explodes up, and those urchins eat all the plants. And basically, urchins will continue eating until there's no more plants. And if there's no plants in an ecosystem can't survive. So that ecosystem just totally collapses. Otters are a keystone species. So there we see otters present, everything's in balance. Otters absent, no plants, too many urchins. Other keystone species include wolves, beavers, because they build dams, so they're the most important species. They're holding an entire environment together. Finally, we have invasive species. Invasive species are ones that are from a different area and are brought in. Invasive species don't have natural predators, so their populations grow out of control. A lionfish brought around the world because it looks cool, but nothing hunts it, so their populations are growing out of control and they're destroying their communities. This is called kudzu, which is a vine from Asia that was brought to the southeastern United States so that cattle could graze on it. The only thing is cattle don't like it and they won't eat it. So this vine just grows out of control. We can see there, this used to be a house that is now covered in kudzu. This is a forest that is just covered in this vine that nothing eats, so nothing keeps it in check. And it's clearly harming the ecosystem. Rabbits were brought to Australia and they started to outcompete the native species eating grass. Australia is in many places a very dry place. So there's not that much grass around. They actually built a fence right down the western part of Australia to keep the rabbits from getting to the other side of the continent. Okay, and when we put all these things together, they make up biodiversity, or the diversity of species in an area. There are three things we want to look at with biodiversity. We look at the species diversity, the geographic diversity, and the genetic diversity. The species diversity just means how many different species are there? What's the number of species? Are there 10 or are there 1,000? The more species, the more diverse they are. We also can look at the geographic diversity. Are they spread out? That is high diversity. Or are they all in one area? That's a low diversity. And then we have diversity within a species. So within this fish species, we can have a high diversity or we can have a low diversity. And these three things make up biodiversity. We have to consider all of them when we determine whether an environment is diverse or not. Why do we care about biodiversity? We care because diverse communities tend to be productive. Diverse communities use each part of the available energy in an ecosystem. And diverse communities can recover better from a disaster. If there's a forest fire, if there's a disease outbreak, if there is some natural disaster, a diverse community can recover much better than a non-diverse community. So if humans demolish a grassland for farmland, what do you think that does to diversity? Well, that makes diversity go down. What about if we introduce an invasive species? So if we introduce an invasive species, it's going to outcompete the normal species, so that's going to decrease diversity. We already know, number 3, the elimination of a keystone species. We know that the diversity is going to crash. What about if we conserve natural habitats? That's going to help increase biodiversity. All right, and that is all for now. I will see you later. Let me know if you have any questions.